For 25 years, Judge Richard Harlan ruled his courtroom like a tyrant, silencing lawyers, destroying lives, and hiding behind the law. But then Jasmine Crockett appeared. She didn't just walk into his courtroom to defend her client. She came to tear his empire down from the inside. What happened next shook the entire justice system to its core. How did one black woman turn Georgia's most feared judge into a criminal, right in his own courtroom? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom in Jefferson County, Georgia, wasn't just a place of law. It was Judge Richard Harlan's kingdom. For 25 years, he ruled from the bench with cold authority, silencing attorneys not with shouting, but with a glance sharp enough to cut. The walls seemed to absorb the weight of injustice, and everyone who entered knew. Here, the law bent to Harlan's will. His gavel didn't deliver justice. It delivered finality. Defense lawyers, especially those of color, treaded carefully, knowing one misstep could ruin a life. Today, though, the air felt different. The gallery was tense, eyes darting, breaths held. Even the bailiff stood taller, tighter. Something was coming, not just a trial, but a storm. Jasmine Crockett walked into that courtroom like a loaded weapon, silent, steady, and deadly precise. Years ago, she had stood in that very spot, fresh out of law school, idealistic, naive. Back then, she believed justice was blind, but Richard Harlan taught her otherwise. He'd humiliated her in open court, cut her down mid-sentence, laughed off her objections like she was a child playing dress-up in a grown-up game. He didn't just dismiss her arguments, he dismissed her existence. That day, she walked out of the courtroom broken, but not beaten. She made a vow, not just to become better, but to come back. And now she had. But she wasn't here for revenge. She was here for a reckoning. Her client, Tyrone Wilkes, sat beside her, wrists chained, eyes heavy with the weight of every black man who had ever been accused before proven, condemned before heard. A decorated veteran, a father, a man who served his country and came home to be treated like a threat. The evidence against him was paper thin, built on a shaky witness and a forced confession. But that didn't matter in Harlan's courtroom. Not when the defendant was black, and the system was built to swallow men like Tyrone whole. Jasmine knew this wasn't just another trial. This was war, and every move she made had to be precise, not just to save Tyrone, but to expose the rot beneath the robe. Because in this fight, the truth wasn't just her weapon, it was her only chance. And just like that, it started. The moment Jasmine Crockett stood up to deliver her first objection, the tone of the entire courtroom shifted. Not because she was wrong, not because her arguments lacked merit, but because Judge Richard Harlan had already decided she didn't matter. She had walked into the courtroom fully prepared, armed with meticulously organized files, color-coded tabs, legal precedents, case notes, witness statements, timestamps, and cross-examination strategies drilled to precision. Every detail, every possibility she had accounted for. She'd fought too many battles to come in blind. But preparation, she was about to learn again, meant nothing in a courtroom where the rules bent around the man with the gavel. From the bench, Harlan didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded the room like an old general who had long forgotten what it meant to be challenged. His eyes, cold, calculating, scanned her not like a lawyer, but like an insect he meant to swat. The moment Jasmine opened her mouth, citing a foundational precedent on admissibility of late disclosed evidence, Harlan shut her down. "Counselor," he said sharply, eyes narrowing, "this court has no time for theatrics or long-winded arguments. Move on." Jasmine froze for a split second, not in fear, but in calculation. It was fast, too fast. The objection wasn't even fully spoken, and already it was dismissed like a child's complaint. She inhaled deeply, glanced quickly at her co-counsel, and pivoted. She would try again, later. But then came the next blow. The prosecution stood up, a young ADA named Philip Calloway. Fresh out of law school, polished hair, expensive watch, cocky demeanor. His opening statement fumbled, tripping over legal jargon like a student in a mock trial. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, voice slightly too loud, We intend to prove beyond any reasonable assumption that the defendant, Mr. Wilkes, knowingly and with malice, committed armed larceny. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Robbery, but Harlan didn't interrupt. Not once. Instead, he leaned forward, almost as if encouraging him, smiling faintly when the boy got lost in his own words, offering nods of assurance, even gently steering him when he fumbled a citation. "You're referring to State versus Morales, correct?" Harlan interjected smoothly, like a teacher helping a favorite student. Yes, Your Honor," Calloway stammered, grateful. "Exactly." And then came the first witness, a convenience store clerk, claiming to have seen Tyrone Wilkes fleeing the scene of an armed robbery. Mid-50s, hunched posture, eyes darting around the courtroom. Jasmine noticed immediately. He was nervous. His hands shook slightly. He paused too long. His eyes didn't meet anyone's. As he took the stand and was sworn in, his voice wavered. "Mr. Thomas," Calloway began confidently, walking toward the jury, "can you tell us what you saw on the night of March 14th? The man swallowed hard. I was behind the register," he said, glancing at his lap. "I heard shouting, real loud, looked up and saw someone running out the door." "And is that person in the courtroom today?" Calloway asked, gesturing with an open hand. Thomas hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Tyrone, then quickly away. I think so. Yeah, he had the same build, similar jacket." "You're saying it was the defendant, Mr. Wilkes?" It looked like him, but I didn't get a real good look, you know. It all happened so fast." Calloway pressed on, voice firmer. "But you're telling this court under oath that you saw the defendant at the scene." The witness shifted in his seat. I believe so. Yes. I believe it was him." Calloway turned to the jury, arms crossed like he'd just cracked the case. "No further questions, Your Honor." But Jasmine noticed. Thomas was nervous. His hands shook slightly. He paused too long. His eyes didn't meet anyone's. He said he thought he saw Tyrone, but wasn't entirely sure. Jasmine made notes. When her turn came to cross-examine, she approached with precision and respect. "Mr. Thomas," she said calmly, "you said you think you saw my client the night of the incident. Can you clarify? How sure are you?" Before the witness could even speak, Harlan's voice cracked through the room like a whip. "Counselor," he barked, "you're badgering the witness." "No, Your Honor," Jasmine replied, keeping her tone level. "I'm simply seeking a clear answer for the record." "Move on," Harlan snapped. She looked at him for half a second, searching for any hint of judicial neutrality. There was none. She turned back to the jury instead. "Let them see. Let them feel the imbalance." Then came the evidence. Jasmine had spent weeks gathering documents that placed Tyrone on the other side of town during the time of the crime. ATM logs, security camera timestamps, even a sworn affidavit from his employer. She presented them, one by one, and watched as Harlan flipped through them with deliberate boredom. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't allow Calloway to respond. He simply muttered, "Not directly relevant," and pushed them aside. Her hands tightened slightly on the table's edge. "Your Honor," she said, measured but firm, "this evidence directly rebuts the prosecution's timeline. It's critical to the defense." "It's redundant and speculative," Harlan replied without even looking up. "We're not here to waste the court's time. Under the rules of discovery, I have every right to—" He cut her off. "Ms. Crockett," he said, voice dropping into something almost mocking, "I don't need a lecture on the law in my own courtroom." The words hit hard, not just because they were disrespectful, but because they were strategic. He wanted her rattled. He wanted the jury to see her flustered, out of control, as if her passion equaled incompetence. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She held his gaze for just 1 second too long, enough to send a message. "I see exactly what you're doing." Still, the damage had begun. The jury watched. The gallery whispered. Even the court clerk shifted uneasily, and yet the pattern continued. Every time Jasmine tried to question a flaw in the prosecution's narrative, objection. Every time she pointed out a contradiction, overruled. Every time she requested clarification, denied. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, and Harlan wielded the blade with surgical precision. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and Harlan had already written the ending. Jasmine's co-counsel leaned in, whispering, "We're being boxed in. They're not even pretending to play fair." She nodded slightly, lips tight. "I know," she said, "but let them keep going. Let them expose themselves." The courtroom was no longer just a stage for legal arguments. It had become a pressure cooker. After Jasmine's cross-examination was cut short and the witness's shaky testimony was allowed to stand unchallenged, something shifted in the air. Jurors shifted in their seats. Not drastically, just enough. A sideways glance, a raised eyebrow. One juror, a middle-aged man in a brown blazer, tapped his pen against the desk without realizing it. Another, a woman with silver-streaked hair, narrowed her eyes at the judge's bench, lips pursed like she was holding back a question she wasn't allowed to ask. No one said a word, but the room felt like it was holding its breath. They weren't lawyers, but they knew what fairness should look like, and this wasn't it. They had seen Jasmine silenced, overruled, dismissed like a child. They had seen Calloway stumble his way through the trial and still receive every benefit of the doubt. And whether they wanted to admit it or not, they were witnessing a courtroom tilted by the weight of a single man's bias. On the benches behind the bar, the gallery wasn't idle either. A row of legal reporters sat in the back, pens scribbling furiously, eyes darting between Jasmine, the judge, and the jury. One reporter, a seasoned journalist for the Georgia Legal Observer, had already flipped to her second notepad. Another leaned into his colleague and whispered, "This isn't just bad optics. This is something else." Their instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a tough trial. It was a case unraveling in real time under the weight of judicial manipulation. Cameras weren't allowed in the room, but every pen stroke felt like a recording of injustice. Even the court sketch artist had stopped drawing Calloway's expression and started sketching Harlan's face instead. Sharper lines, colder eyes. The bailiff stood motionless, jaw clenched, eyes locked forward. He'd seen enough trials to recognize when things weren't right, but he said nothing, because no one ever said anything. Not here, not in Harlan's court. That's how the system stayed exactly the way it was. And Jasmine, she felt it all. The unspoken tension, the eyes that wouldn't meet hers. The weight of knowing the jury saw what was happening, but didn't know if they were allowed to believe it. She sat still, outwardly calm, but every muscle in her body was coiled, waiting. Because what was happening in that room wasn't subtle anymore. It was blatant. And that kind of injustice, in front of that many witnesses, wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. The silence around her spoke volumes, but the whisper beside her cut deeper than anything the judge had said. Tyrone leaned in, his voice barely audible, but heavy like a man carrying a lifetime of disappointment. "Ms. Crockett," he murmured, head bowed low, eyes locked on the floor. "Don't bother anymore. This court ain't built for people like us." His shoulders, once squared with pride, now sagged like a soldier returning from a war he was never meant to win. His hands, still cuffed, twitched with helpless frustration. He wasn't just losing hope in the trial. He was losing hope in everything. In the system, in fairness, in himself. Jasmine didn't respond. Not right away. Her eyes stayed forward, cold and locked on the bench where Judge Harlan presided like a monarch over a broken kingdom. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. But inside, fire surged beneath her calm. She had seen it before. That moment when a client breaks, not because of guilt, but because of the weight of being black in a courtroom designed to bury the truth beneath procedure. Tyrone's words weren't just exhaustion, they were surrender, and she couldn't allow it. Not here, not now, not in front of Harlan, who would gladly turn that surrender into a conviction. She turned her head slowly, just enough for Tyrone to see the steel in her gaze. No words, just conviction, silent, unshakable. Her presence told him what she refused to say aloud. We don't bow to injustice. We fight it, even when it's hopeless. Because if she gave up now, if she let his voice go unanswered, then she wasn't just losing this case. She was proving Harlan right. And Jasmine Crockett didn't come back to play by Harlan's rules. She came to break them. She didn't answer Tyrone's plea with words, but with silence sharp enough to cut through doubt. Still, as she looked back to the bench, even Jasmine couldn't deny what the courtroom had become. A battlefield tilted against her at every angle. Objections overruled, evidence excluded, witnesses redirected. Every legal pathway she stepped onto was already blocked before she could finish a sentence. And the worst part wasn't the rulings, it was the performance. Judge Harlan sat high above, calm and unreadable, as if every dismissal of her argument was routine. Beside him, Philip Calloway smirked like a man who thought the game was already won. He whispered to a colleague, chuckling, confident that the verdict had already been carved in stone behind closed doors. The courtroom felt heavier with each minute, not from the weight of the trial, but from the slow suffocation of justice itself. Jasmine knew the signs. She wasn't losing the case on facts. She was losing it on control. Harlan had seized the narrative, and every move she made was being twisted into a display of desperation. So she did the only thing a seasoned fighter could do when the tide is too strong. She pulled back, not in defeat, but in design. She stopped objecting, stopped pressing. She let the silence grow. Let the prosecution think they were cruising. Let the jury feel the void. Calloway took the bait, growing bolder with each word, his tone cockier, his posture looser. Harlan leaned back with folded arms, allowing it all to unfold like he was presiding over a courtroom drama he'd directed 100 times. But they didn't realize the truth. Jasmine wasn't stepping back to surrender. She was pulling them in, just close enough to fall. She had been silent long enough. Letting them feel victorious was part of her trap. But now it was time to spring it. As Philip Calloway droned on with false confidence, his voice beginning to rise with arrogance, Jasmine reached down and slowly opened the red tab folder she hadn't touched since the trial began. Her fingers moved with intention. Every detail, every line of text had been reviewed, highlighted, time-stamped. It was the kind of document that didn't just poke holes in the prosecution, it shattered it. With calm precision, she rose to her feet, holding the single sheet of paper high enough for the courtroom to see. Her voice when it came was low but electric. Your Honor, the defense moves to introduce new evidence. Evidence withheld by the prosecution in direct violation of Brady v. Maryland. The words hit the courtroom like a jolt. A murmur rippled through the gallery. One of the jurors leaned forward, frowning. A reporter in the back stopped writing mid-sentence. Jasmine walked to the bench slowly, confidently, never breaking eye contact with the judge. This document, she said, placing it on the edge of her desk and tapping it once, is a time-stamped GPS data log that proves, beyond any doubt, that my client, Tyrone Wilkes, was not at the scene of the robbery. In fact, he was 5 miles away, inside a rehabilitation center where he signed in electronically. This information was submitted to the state 2 weeks ago by the facility's legal office and was never shared with the defense. Not once. She let that sit, her words hanging in the air like a suspended blade. Under the Brady rule, the withholding of exculpatory evidence is not just unethical, it is unconstitutional. Calloway froze. His hands clutched the edge of the podium. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Harlan's face darkened, but not with surprise, with annoyance. He didn't even glance at the paper. His reply came fast, hard, and rehearsed. Motion denied. That evidence is inadmissible and irrelevant at this stage of the trial. Jasmine blinked once, jaw tightening. Your Honor, this is a constitutional violation. The prosecution knowingly suppressed material that could prove my client's innocence. You are out of line, Ms. Crockett, Harlan snapped, leaning forward, voice now raised. I said the evidence is inadmissible. Period. Jasmine didn't back away. She took one small step forward, her hands gripping the lectern. Her voice dropped, quiet and deliberate. So the court is choosing to ignore a Brady violation on the record? Harlan's eyes narrowed to slits. The gavel came down, loud and violent. Enough, he thundered. This courtroom will not be turned into a soapbox for conspiracy theories. One more word and you will be held in contempt. Am I understood? The gavel's crack echoed like a gunshot. The bailiff twitched. Jurors jolted in their seats. The gallery erupted in a wave of suppressed tension. Shuffling feet, quiet gasps, pens pausing mid-note. What had been subtle bias until now was suddenly and unmistakably exposed. One juror, an older black man in the front row, shook his head slowly, a frown growing deeper with each passing second. A woman beside him, who had remained passive for most of the trial, now looked visibly disturbed. The air in the courtroom changed. It wasn't just heavy, it was charged like the moments before a storm hits. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat down slowly, her back straight, her hands resting on the defense table like a general returning to command. Her expression was unreadable, not because she was confused or defeated, but because this was the moment she had been waiting for. Everything had just gone exactly to plan. While the court saw a defiant attorney being silenced by a powerful judge, Jasmine knew better. This wasn't defeat. This was the final move in a carefully laid trap, a trap that had been building for weeks, step by silent step. Because Jasmine hadn't walked into this courtroom expecting justice. She had walked in expecting war, and she came armed with something far more powerful than a sharp tongue or airtight case law. She came armed with the truth and proof that the system was rigged against it. For days she'd let Harlan show his true colors, never stopping him, never shouting over him, never letting emotion get the better of her. Every denied objection, every smirk, every moment he interrupted her mid-sentence or validated Calloway's fumbling arguments had been quietly logged, not by chance, not by luck, but by design. 3 rows behind her, seated like any ordinary trial watcher, was a journalist from the Southern Law Ledger, a longtime court reporter with federal credentials and a reputation for exposing legal misconduct. Jasmine had called in a favor, and he wasn't just taking notes. He was transcribing injustice in real time, his fingers flying across his notepad like a stenographer possessed. 2 rows to the right, dressed in a modest gray suit, sat Angela Cho, an investigator with the State Bar's Ethics Enforcement Division. Officially, she was observing courtroom procedure for continuing education. Unofficially, she had been sent by Jasmine's team with the quiet support of civil rights watchdog groups to record every deviation from proper judicial conduct. She was already on her 3rd page. Sitting near the back, close to the courtroom exit, was a law student intern wearing glasses and a neutral expression, one of Jasmine's own team members, planted months earlier during jury selection week. He had memorized every motion denied, every irregularity in Harlan's courtroom behavior. His pocket carried a time-stamped notebook. His phone, tucked in his lap, recorded audio legally under the state's one-party consent statute for public court proceedings. He hadn't looked up once. He didn't need to. He was building a timeline, a case within the case. Even the courtroom sketch artist, hired through neutral court channels, had been subtly briefed. Jasmine didn't need her to lie, just to be honest, to draw what she saw, the judge's visible hostility, the contrast between his softness toward Calloway and his cold disdain toward Jasmine. The gavel raised in fury, the jaw clenched, the pointing finger, all captured in charcoal and ink. No camera could have done it better. And as for the jury, Jasmine hadn't spoken to them, hadn't looked at them more than necessary, but she had felt them watching. Not just her, but the pattern, the weight of it, the imbalance. You couldn't silence the truth forever, not when 12 people were watching it unravel before their eyes. She didn't say another word after the Brady motion was denied. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She let the silence settle, let the tension ferment, let the weight of injustice become so heavy it pressed down on every person in that room. Philip Calloway, oblivious to what was coming, leaned back in his chair, smug and relaxed. He believed he'd won. So did Harlan. The judge leaned into the bench, face composed, as if he had restored order and reasserted control. But they didn't realize the irony. By trying to silence Jasmine, they had spoken louder than she ever could. The evidence of bias wasn't just in her notes, it was now in theirs. And that's when she glanced, just once, over her shoulder. Angela Cho looked up and gave a single subtle nod. The reporter raised his pen, finished his final line, and closed the notebook with a soft snap. The sketch artist paused, brush in the air, eyes locked on Harlan's scowl. The pieces were in place. The trap had closed. And Jasmine Crockett. She folded her hands, sat still, waited. because she knew something the rest of the courtroom didn't. The next sound they would hear wouldn't be a gavel. It would be the heavy wooden doors opening, and justice, long delayed, would finally walk in. And then it happened. The silence in the courtroom was sharp enough to cut. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant, electric, like the final inhale before lightning splits the sky. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber swung open, not with chaos, not with noise, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of inevitability. Every pair of eyes turned. The jury, the gallery, even the bailiff. The moment cracked the room like a fault line. Two federal agents stepped inside, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other lean, older, both dressed in dark suits that made them seem carved from stone. Their footsteps echoed with surgical precision, not rushed, not hesitant. The seal of the U.S. Department of Justice gleamed on the badge held forward as they approached. No words yet, just movement, controlled, absolute. And with each step toward the bench, the temperature in the room dropped. Judge Richard Harlan, still seated high above, stared down at them like they were trespassers in his kingdom. His fingers gripped the sides of the bench as if he could stop them by force of will alone. But he didn't speak, not yet. Maybe he didn't believe it. Maybe he was waiting for someone to intervene. But no one did, because deep down everyone knew what this was. Jasmine Crockett knew. Tyrone Wilkes knew. The jurors knew. Even the prosecution had gone pale. This wasn't chaos. This was accountability walking through the front door. The taller agent stepped forward first, voice calm, measured, and devastatingly clear. Judge Richard Harlan, he said, projecting for the room to hear, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, conspiracy to tamper with court proceedings, accepting bribes, and multiple violations of civil rights under federal statute. His words landed like thunder. The sound didn't echo. It stuck, hanging in the air, pressing against the marble, the oak, the chest of every soul in that room. Harlan's lips parted. He blinked once. For a moment, he looked very old. This is absurd, he spat, standing up abruptly. His voice cracked, and a full glass of water on the bench tipped, shattering on the floor beside him. I'm in the middle of a trial. You don't have jurisdiction to barge into my courtroom like this. His voice rose in pitch, not in control but in panic. I am the sitting judge on record. The second agent stepped up beside his partner, eyes cold, voice steady. And this courtroom is now a federal crime scene. Harlan recoiled, shaking his head violently. This is my courtroom, he shouted louder now, voice fraying at the edges. These people are in my charge. And then came the sentence that ended everything. No, the agent replied, they're not yours anymore. The silence that followed wasn't just still. It was heavy, unforgiving. The gallery sat motionless. The reporters' pens hovered midair. A juror's jaw dropped slightly. Philip Calloway, who had been seated until that moment, stood and immediately sat back down again, as if unsure of what to do with his hands, his posture, his career. The bailiff didn't move. He wasn't stopping it. No one was. The reign of Judge Harlan, untouchable, unchallenged, was over. And it was ending right in front of the people he once ruled without question. The taller agent reached forward, calm and professional. Sir, place your hands behind your back. Harlan didn't obey, not at first. He stood frozen, fingers clenched, eyes darting across the room as if expecting someone, anyone, to object. But none came. There were no defenders, no loyal voices, no final authority to shield him from what was now unavoidable. Slowly, reluctantly, his arms moved behind his back. The agent brought the cuffs forward. The click of steel was louder than any gavel ever struck. Judge Richard Harlan, the man who had silenced attorneys, dismissed defendants, manipulated justice, and spoken law as if it were his own personal doctrine, was now handcuffed on the very bench from which he once judged others. His black robe sagged at the shoulders. His face was pale. He looked not like a figure of power, but like a man unmasked. Flash bulbs fired from the back as journalists captured history unfolding. The courtroom sketch artist dropped her pencil. The court stenographer paused for the first time all morning. A few people in the gallery gasped quietly. Others said nothing, just stared in stunned awe. The jurors, still sworn to impartiality, couldn't hide the disbelief on their faces. Jasmine Crockett did not move. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply watched. Her eyes locked on the man who once humiliated her in this very room, who had buried countless defendants under the weight of bias disguised as authority, who had gambled everything on the assumption that power made him untouchable. And now that man stood in handcuffs. Not a judge, not even a symbol, just another man who thought the law was his to control until it came for him instead. And Jasmine, steady and silent, had made sure it finally did. The echoes of the handcuffs had barely faded when the courtroom door opened again, quietly without drama. There were no agents this time, no shouting, no flash of authority, just calm, practiced footsteps. Judge Raymond Ellis entered, his presence alone grounding the room like a reset of reality. His reputation preceded him, measured, incorruptible, the kind of man whose silence often said more than another judge's ruling. He wore his robe like a responsibility, not a symbol, and when he took the bench, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale. Finally, someone who hadn't been bought, bent, or blinded by power. He gave a nod to the jury, looked once at the defense, then gently to Jasmine. "Ms. Crockett, the court recognizes you." She didn't move at first. The gravity of what had just happened still hung in the air, clinging to the walls like smoke from a fire that had scorched everything. She glanced at Tyrone Wilkes, still in cuffs, still seated like a man bracing for a verdict that wasn't real. He didn't meet her eyes. He was still waiting for the moment it would all fall apart again. Jasmine stood, not with triumph, but with purpose. Her suit was wrinkled at the elbows. Her voice was hoarse from hours of argument, but her presence was immovable. "Your Honor," she began, calm but cold, "I move to dismiss all charges against my client, Tyrone Wilkes, with prejudice." A murmur rippled through the gallery, but she didn't react. Her focus was locked on the bench, her words chosen like instruments of surgery, not for effect, but for truth. What this court witnessed today was not just the arrest of a judge. It was the exposure of a system that allowed a man like Harlan to sit on that bench for 25 years and mistake power for law. She took a breath, not to compose herself, but to let the words land. "This trial was compromised before it ever began," she continued. "From the moment we entered this courtroom, the rules were rewritten in real time to serve one goal: conviction, not based on fact, not based on truth, but based on who held the gavel. Every motion was denied before it could be heard. Every piece of evidence that pointed to my client's innocence was deemed inadmissible without review. The prosecution was guided, protected, and coached, not by law, but by favor." She turned slowly toward the jury, not to persuade, but to honor them. "And yet, despite all of it, you saw it. You felt it. You heard every word, every silence. Every time I was told to sit down, not because I was wrong, but because I was inconvenient. And most of all, you saw what they did to Mr. Wilkes, a veteran, a citizen, a man who was presumed guilty the moment he walked into this room. Not because of evidence, but because of bias, because of history, because of who he is." Then she turned back to Judge Ellis, and her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of everything left unsaid. "This court cannot pretend that removing Judge Harlan fixes what's already broken. This was not a fair trial. It was a performance, a weaponization of the robe. And if we allow this case to continue, knowing what we know now, then we are complicit. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking for pity. I am demanding the law hold itself accountable. Dismiss this case, not as an exception, but as the first sign that justice still means something in this room." She paused. "This trial never should have happened. Not like this. Not under him. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a script. And my client was never meant to survive it." She stepped back, and the room held its breath again, not because of fear, but because the truth had been laid bare. And now, it had nowhere left to hide. The silence that followed Jasmine's motion stretched long and heavy, like the final breath before a verdict drops. Judge Ellis sat motionless behind the bench, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the case file resting open in front of him. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him, but the room dared not make a sound. Even the air seemed to pause. Jasmine remained standing, her back straight, eyes calm, though her pulse hammered against her ribs like a war drum. Tyrone sat beside her, motionless, his cuffed hands clasped between his knees. He didn't look up. After everything, he trained himself not to. He didn't believe in second chances anymore. Not in courtrooms like this. Not after what he'd seen. But Judge Ellis believed in the law. The real law. The one that existed not to protect the powerful, but to defend the defenseless. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low but resonant, filling the room with the kind of gravity only truth can bring. Having reviewed the trial record in full, he began, eyes locked on the document in front of him, including testimony, evidentiary rulings, and the recent developments involving former Judge Harlan. It is the finding of this court that the trial proceedings were fundamentally and irreversibly compromised. His voice didn't waver, didn't rise. It didn't need to. The repeated suppression of lawful objections, denial of exculpatory evidence, and the clear pattern of judicial misconduct have not only eroded the integrity of this case, but have violated the most basic tenets of due process under the Constitution. He looked up, directly at Tyrone, and for the first time in the entire trial, a judge looked at him not as a case file, but as a man. Therefore, Judge Ellis continued, all charges against Mr. Tyrone Wilkes are hereby dismissed, with prejudice. He is to be released from custody immediately. Time didn't explode. It cracked, quietly, profoundly, like a shell finally splitting after years of pressure. Tyrone didn't react at first. He sat still, his breath shallow, as if waiting for the judge to take it back. But the words were real. The gavel struck once, not in anger, but as confirmation. The bailiff approached, far gentler than before, and for once the keys didn't symbolize confinement. They meant something else entirely. The handcuffs came off. The sound of metal releasing was soft, but it cut louder than anything else had that day. Tyrone looked down at his wrists. His skin was raw, where the cuffs had rubbed too long, too tight. He turned his hands over as if seeing them for the first time. Hands that had built, carried, fought, and been shackled by a lie. His chest hitched. His jaw trembled. Then came the tears. Not theatrical, not performative. Just a man who had survived the kind of silence most don't come back from. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Heavy, gasping sobs that pulled everything out of him he'd held in for years. Jasmine stood beside him, still composed, still. But her eyes softened as she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. No words yet. Not while he wept. Not while he crumbled into the truth of his own freedom. When he finally looked up, red-eyed, lips parted, shaking, she leaned in and spoke quietly, but firmly. This is your moment, Tyrone. You earned it. You survived it. She squeezed his shoulder once. But don't mistake this for the finish line. He blinked at her, confused, lost in the magnitude of the moment. And then she said it. The words she'd carried with her since the day she took this case. The words no verdict could replace. Your freedom is the beginning. Real justice. That's something bigger. That means fixing the system that tried to break you. That means making sure no one else ever sits in that chair again for a crime they didn't commit. Tyrone stared at her, his breath still ragged, but his head nodded once, slowly. It wasn't just agreement. It was understanding. A man who had nearly been buried by the law was now, somehow, standing on the edge of helping reshape it. Around them, the courtroom was still. The jury sat speechless. The reporters had stopped writing. Even Calloway, now seated alone at the prosecution's table, looked down at his own notes, hollow-eyed and shaken. The system had shown its teeth, and for once it had been forced to swallow the consequences. But Jasmine wasn't basking in the moment. She didn't raise her hands in victory. She didn't turn to the crowd or let herself collapse in relief. She stood like she always had, resolute, focused, already thinking ahead. Because this one trial was over. But the war had only just begun. Tyrone's freedom was a beginning, not a conclusion. In the days that followed the trial, Jasmine Crockett didn't attend press conferences. She didn't sit for interviews, didn't bask in headlines, didn't soak in applause. Because while the cameras were still zoomed in on a disgraced judge being led away in cuffs, Jasmine's eyes were already scanning the bigger picture, one far darker than anything the world had seen in that single courtroom. What happened to Tyrone wasn't an exception. It was a symptom, a warning flare from a system that had been quietly bleeding people dry for years. And Richard Harlan hadn't just been a corrupt judge. He'd been a gatekeeper of injustice, and the gate had been wide open for decades. So Jasmine did what she'd always done. She fought back, not with anger, but with action. She founded Justice Reclaimed, not as a nonprofit, not as a PR stunt, but as a war room, a legal strike force designed to do what no court, no committee, and no politician had dared to attempt. A full-scale audit of every case Richard Harlan had ever presided over. She and her team compiled a list of over 3,000 dockets dating back 25 years. Names, numbers, charges, sentences. Every one of them a possible casualty of a man who had abused the robe like a weapon. She assembled a team, not just lawyers, but data analysts, retired judges, exonerees, former public defenders who had once stood in that same courtroom and whispered, "There's something wrong here," but had never been heard. They formed working groups, scanned transcripts, flagged rulings with patterns of suppression. They created heat maps of judicial bias. They ran algorithms on sentence disparities. They tracked how often Harlan overruled black attorneys versus white ones. The data spoke louder than any opening statement ever could. And what they found was devastating. There were men serving 20 years for crimes where the only evidence was a coerced confession, women whose testimony had been dismissed as emotional, minors tried as adults, veterans like Tyrone who had never stood a chance. The same phrases repeated in transcript after transcript: objection overruled, inadmissible, motion denied, like a script written in ink, not blood, but with the same effect. Over time, it became clear Harlan hadn't just passed judgment, he'd orchestrated outcomes. But now, for the first time, his victims had a voice. Cases long forgotten were being reopened. Judges were issuing new hearings. Innocent people who had given up on freedom were now being called back to courtrooms, not to be punished again, but to be heard, truly heard, for the first time. Some wept. Some didn't believe it. Some had already lost everything and came only to say, "I told you." But they came. And with every reopened case, the shadow Harlan had cast over the justice system shrank just a little more. The media started calling it the Crockett docket revolution. Editorials ran with headlines like "One Lawyer's Crusade Against Corruption" and "The Undoing of Jefferson County." But Jasmine didn't care for the spotlight. She stayed in the trenches, reviewing records, meeting families, speaking with the wrongfully convicted, many of whom had no one left waiting for them outside prison walls. Her goal was never the headlines. Her goal was repair. And every time a case was overturned, every time a family was reunited, every time an apology was issued where silence once lived, Jasmine reminded her team why they started. Because justice is not justice if it only arrives for the lucky few. She knew the system wouldn't fix itself. She knew for every Harlan caught, there were others still robed, still ruling unchecked. But she also knew this: the silence was broken. The fear had shifted. Power was being questioned. And she had proven, once and for all, that no one, not even the bench, is above the law. Justice Reclaimed didn't just review cases. It forced the entire state to ask itself a question. What happens when a judge becomes the criminal and no one notices for 25 years? And thanks to Jasmine Crockett, they couldn't ignore the answer anymore. The system was trembling, not collapsing, not yet, but trembling, undeniably. One overturned case became 3. 3 became 9. Old rulings were vacated, prosecutors were put under scrutiny, and internal investigations began to quietly unfold in counties across the state. What Jasmine Crockett had triggered wasn't just a ripple, it was a shift in the ground itself, a deep overdue reckoning in a structure that had stood for too long on the backs of the voiceless. And the press, they noticed. She never sought their attention, but they followed her anyway. Headlines spread faster than case files. Her name appeared in op-eds, morning broadcasts, late-night commentary. The New York Times called her the conscience of the courtroom. The Atlantic labeled her a scalpel in a world of hammers. But the one that stuck, the one that was repeated on cable news and echoed across civil rights blogs and legal podcasts, was the quote that made it onto the cover of The Nation beside her photo. The woman who forced justice to look at itself. It wasn't praise Jasmine craved. It was pressure. Because every spotlight, every soundbite, every microphone shoved in her face reminded her of what wasn't finished. Tyrone may have walked free, but dozens still sat in cells built by Harlan's rulings. Some were still waiting for letters from lawyers that might never come. Some had died behind bars. And Jasmine knew what the cameras wouldn't say. That exposing one corrupt judge didn't fix a machine. It just proved how easily the machine can be hijacked. So she turned the attention into fuel. While news vans parked outside her office and photojournalists waited for a staged reaction she'd never give them, Jasmine disappeared back into her files. She slept 3 hours a night. She ate takeout over court transcripts. Her apartment floor became a map of injustice. Papers, photos, notes on victims' names and what had been done to them. There were no awards on her walls, no plaques, no framed magazine covers. Just a calendar with names and deadlines. Each red circle wasn't a celebration, it was a promise. She gave speeches, not at banquets, but in classrooms. She mentored students who didn't believe they could make it to law school because they'd never seen someone like her at the top. She showed up in juvenile courts where other lawyers wouldn't. She filed motions in rural counties that had never seen a black woman in a courtroom, except behind the defense table. And she kept saying the same thing, again and again, to whoever would listen. Justice isn't something that arrives. It's something you go get. She didn't soften her message for comfort. She didn't adjust her tone to sound palatable. Jasmine Crockett didn't give the system an exit ramp. She stood in its way. In one televised interview, a reporter asked her how it felt to have changed the landscape of justice in Georgia. Jasmine stared at him for a beat too long, then answered, "I didn't change it. I just exposed it. Now we have to decide if we're brave enough to fix it." Even some of her critics began to fall quiet. Lawyers who once whispered that she was too loud, too angry, now asked to sit in on her case reviews. Judges who had doubted her started revisiting their own rulings. Prosecutors began assigning senior staff to double-check past cases. Bit by bit, inch by inch, the culture began to shift. Not everywhere, not fast enough, but undeniably. Still, Jasmine refused to take credit because she remembered every time she walked into court and was told she was being too emotional. Every time a judge looked at her hair instead of her briefs. Every time a client cried in a back room because they thought no one would believe them. She remembered standing in front of Judge Harlan as a young attorney and being humiliated for daring to speak. And she remembered that feeling, the quiet, burning sense that the rules were never written for her, only against her. That memory stayed with her longer than any applause ever could. Years passed. Justice reclaimed expanded into multiple states. Federal grants were awarded. Partner law schools joined. More than 200 cases were under review, and several led to full exonerations. Jasmine declined every invitation to run for office. She didn't want to be a senator. She didn't want to be a judge. She wanted to stay where the damage was, in the trenches. There was one night, late, long after the news cycle had moved on, when Jasmine walked back into the same courtroom where it all started. The lights were off. The air was still. The judge's bench sat empty. She stood there alone, facing the rows of pews, the jury box, the witness stand. No audience, no jury, just memory. She stepped to the defense table and rested her hand on the wood. This was where she'd nearly lost. This was where Harlan had tried to break her. This was where justice had once been denied, and then reclaimed. And she whispered just to herself, "You don't get to own this place anymore." Then she turned and walked out. Because the courtroom didn't define her. Her fight did, and it wasn't over. Not until the scales balanced for everyone. Not just the ones lucky enough to find a fighter like her. Justice had finally looked at itself. and it had seen Jasmine Crockett, staring back, unafraid, unbending, and still moving forward. Justice, Jasmine Crockett's crusade teaches, is not a marble abstraction, but a living, breathing organism that can be starved or fed, bruised or healed. So the first blistering lesson is that vigilance must be relentless, because corruption rarely announces itself with banners and brass bands, but instead seeps into court calendars, discovery deadlines, whispered hallway deals, and off-the-record smiles, thriving precisely because ordinary people assume the paperwork is too dense, the tradition too sacred, or the gatekeepers too learned to err. Yet one determined lawyer proved the opposite by treating every ignored footnote, every overruled objection, every side-eyed smirk as a breadcrumb on a trail that eventually led not merely to a single tyrant cracked open, but to a system forced to see its own reflection and recoil. The second lesson, hammered out on the anvil of grisly reality, is that injustice hides most comfortably inside routine humiliation. Those moments when a judge mocks a young attorney's diction, when a bailiff smirks as shackles click shut on a defendant who can't afford bail, when a clerk misfiles exculpatory evidence because nobody will double-check. Because each tiny cut seems survivable until years later, you realize the body politic has been bleeding out the whole time. And Jasmine refused to let those minor insults remain minor, cataloging them until she could present a mosaic of misconduct so vast even the most comfortable observer could no longer pretend it was all coincidence. Third comes the revelation about power. It is allergic to sunlight and nourished by fatigue, meaning that tyrants do not fear outrage. Outrage burns hot and then cools, but dread persistence, the quiet, disciplined drumbeat of a woman who refuses to leave, who studies transcripts at 3 a.m., who converts every dismissal into data, every insult into evidence, and every snicker into another nail in the coffin of a corrupt reign. Because power, once cornered by that kind of methodical courage, loses its swagger and eventually its oxygen. Fourth, the saga dismantles the myth that a single firing or prison sentence fixes an institution. For Jasmine discovered that Harlan's bench was merely a broken spoke in a wheel that had rolled over human lives for decades. So she built Justice Reclaimed like a forensic autopsy, scanning thousands of dockets, feeding rulings into algorithms that glowed red wherever racial bias, sentencing disparity, or procedural cruelty spiked. And then she turned the raw, blinding data into public exhibits so transparent that even legislators who once cited isolated incidents now muttered about emergency committees and supplemental budgets to address systemic reform. Proving transparency is not optional. It is the antiseptic without which infection always returns. Fifth, her journey warns that comfort is complicity dressed in silk robes. The moment a society grows satisfied with one televised downfall, it leaves the next victim defenseless. So Jasmine rejected the talk show circuit, the book advances, the podium invitations, understanding that applause is merely the system's way of asking her to slow down, rest, and become yet another inspirational footnote instead of an ongoing threat. And she answered by launching case reviews in neighboring counties, by mentoring public defenders drowning under caseloads, and by reminding every donor that money without follow-through is just hush money in prettier clothes. Sixth, the story insists that hope is not sentimental. It is corporal, wearing jumpsuits and handcuffs, signing affidavits in cells that smell of bleach and fear. And when it is finally set loose, it does not walk out of prison gates with tidy gratitude, but with tears like Tyrone's, a flood that sweeps away the lie that wrongful convictions are statistical rounding errors. Because each tear is a data point that humanizes the spreadsheet and forces the public to confront the real cost of clerical indifference. Seventh, Jasmine's campaign underscores that no warrior wins wars alone. Investigators mined archives, statisticians built bias heat maps, journalists dotted newsrooms with stories that refused to die after one news cycle, and retired judges quietly coached young associates on how to withstand the procedural ambushes still lurking in courtrooms untouched by reform, proving solidarity when orchestrated with rigor can crack even the thickest concrete of institutional inertia, and that movements succeed not by crowning heroes, but by multiplying them. Eighth, and perhaps most urgent, her odyssey redefines justice as a verb that must be conjugated daily. File, appeal, argue, expose, revise. Because the instant we treat it as a static noun safely displayed behind mahogany benches, we forfeit it to those who see law as a personal cudgel, which is why Jasmine keeps her calendar thick with court dates instead of gala dinners, why her victories become checklists rather than stopping points, and why every closed case file on her desk is promptly replaced by another, because justice left unattended rusts into ritual, and ritual metastasizes into oppression. Finally, the narrative delivers a collective theology of redemption. When an innocent man steps back into sunlight, the community does more than cheer. It recalibrates. School children hear the story and internalize the difference between legal and just. Legislators reconsider bills they once ignored, and even skeptical citizens find themselves asking, if this could happen to Tyrone, whom have we already forgotten? So each exoneration becomes a seed, each seed a tree of watchfulness, and forests of vigilance are exactly what corrupted systems fear most, because forests are hard to uproot and the roots talk to one another, passing warnings underground until courage becomes contagious. Thus, Jasmine's real legacy is not the fall of Richard Harlan, nor the headlines that dubbed her the woman who forced justice to look at itself, but the echo she leaves in every courthouse hallway, a whispered, irrevocable truth that law belongs to the people, not the powerful, and it will answer to us as often as we demand, which means the story's true ending is up to anyone willing to listen, pick up the file, and keep the fight alive. And now it's your turn. Because this story, Jasmine's story, Tyrone's story, isn't meant to be watched like a movie and forgotten by morning. This isn't fiction wrapped in dramatic lighting and courtroom theatrics. This is real. It happened. And it is happening again, right now, in courtrooms you've never heard of, with judges you'll never see on the news, and defendants who don't have a Jasmine Crockett sitting beside them. The real tragedy isn't just that it took 25 years for Judge Harlan to fall. It's that thousands of others just like him are still standing, still ruling, still deciding fates behind robes and sealed doors. The question is not if injustice exists. The question is what you're going to do now that you've seen it. We tell ourselves the system is flawed, but the truth is harder than that. The system is functioning exactly as it was built to protect itself, to preserve power, to grind down the people least able to defend themselves, and do it in silence. It's not just broken. It was designed to break people. And unless people like you step into the storm, unless you choose to feel uncomfortable, to get involved, to say something when it's easier to say nothing, then it keeps going. One more trial, one more man in cuffs, one more name whispered and forgotten. But it doesn't have to stay this way. Because if one woman with a voice, a case file, and a spine made of iron can bring down a judge, imagine what we could do if we stood together. Imagine if we turned courtroom galleries into battlegrounds. If we flooded jury pools with citizens who knew their rights and refused to sleep through testimony. If we treated every biased ruling like a spark and fanned it into fire. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from money. She didn't have legacy behind her. She had fury, focus, and a refusal to let another innocent man be swallowed whole. That's it. That's the recipe, and it's one we can all follow. So let's stop pretending this fight belongs to someone else. You don't need to be a lawyer to demand justice. You don't need to wear a robe or hold a law degree to recognize what's wrong. You just have to stop looking away. You have to stop scrolling past headlines and saying, "That's awful," before moving on. Justice doesn't live in press releases or presidential speeches. It lives in the voices of people who refuse to shut up when the room gets uncomfortable. It lives in community organizers, in local election booths, in public defenders' inboxes, in court transcripts that no one's read since the verdict was sealed. It lives wherever ordinary people say, "Not this time." So what can you do? Start with your own backyard. Learn the names of the judges in your county. Pay attention to who's on the bench, not just at the Supreme Court, but in municipal courts, traffic courts, juvenile courts, because that's where injustice breeds, in the quiet, low-level places no one's watching. Volunteer at legal clinics. fund bail projects, support journalists investigating misconduct, show up to public hearings, ask your school board about restorative justice, call your city council, talk to your friends about mandatory minimums, and when someone tells you it's complicated, look them in the eye and say, I don't care. I'm staying in the fight anyway. Because here's the truth. Jasmine Crockett is rare, but she shouldn't be. She didn't win because the system made room for her. She won because she made room for herself. And she did it not just for Tyrone, but for every person who never got their name cleared. For every family who buried a son labeled a criminal. For every parent who cried in the hallway when a sentence came down like a hammer. She didn't fight for the headline. She fought so you'd know it's possible, so you'd see her standing there and say, if she can, maybe I can too. This is your moment. This is your mirror. The question is not whether you were moved. The question is what you'll do now that you've been awakened. So let the discomfort sit in your gut. Let the anger pulse through your chest. Let the fire Jasmine lit burn long after the screen goes dark. Because there are still cases being heard this week by judges who think no one's watching. Still men pacing cold floors in cells they don't belong in. Still women being silenced mid-sentence in courtrooms stacked against them. Still attorneys with no resources, buried in caseloads, praying for a miracle. Still prosecutors who treat human lives like stepping stones on their way to the next promotion. Still silence. Break that silence. Be louder. Be relentless. Be a witness who doesn't just watch, but acts. Because Jasmine did her part. Tyrone walked free, and now justice is knocking on your door. Will you answer, or will you let the gavel fall again on someone who didn't stand a chance? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.